Thanks for sticking in. This is Feedback Farm. I'm Tom Halloran. I'm Gregory Sidorka.
I'm Claire Sullivan.
And we have varied backgrounds, and we came together around wanting to do, wanting to get this a local agriculture project off the ground. I went to a farming high school and then was a software developer for a long time.
My background is in software, and Tom and I know each other from the startup that we used to work at.
And I have worked in agricultural research, mostly in the tropics, but I wanted to do something more hands-on.
So we're a little bit of a different take than anything that I think that has presented so far. We're a small production agriculture operation in Brooklyn, but we have a research component, and the mission is to develop best practices and invest in agriculture research in the urban context, because we see that there's a fundamental lack of agricultural research and extension in the urban environment. And
our goal, one of our goals that we're going to talk about is to publish in an academic journal about our results from this.
So this is a picture of our Bergen lot. This is like at the junction of Borum Hill and Gowanus, in very close to about a block away from the Barclays Center. So this is some more pictures of the Bergen lot. If you go from the on the left hand side, the two images are the lots before we got there, and we kicked off last winter with lots of planning meetings, and we got access to the lots in April of this year. And there was effectively a brownfield where what we started on were the footprint of 3 brownstones in Borum Hill that were bulldozed into the ground, and they were conveniently separated by the city into three distinct lots, because there were all these trash complaints, and they have different owners, and they wanted to be able to keep track of who to give the tickets to.
So it's kind of a complex land situation. If you look at these 2 pieces of land on this close side of the fence and then the far side of the fence, those are owned by HPD, owned by the city, and then the central piece of land, which we are on and looking out at Brooklyn in that picture, that's actually a private land.
And you can see the Williamsburg Savings Bank up there, and it's really convenient because it has we actually use it as a clock. It's the only time I've ever used it as a clock. And then down at the bottom is some of our yields. So we grew 9 varieties of tomatoes, heirlooms, and we marketed to 2 local restaurants and 2 little grocery stores in Brooklyn, and then also had an on-site farm stand. So here's our second lot. It's forming. It's at this is, so I should tell a little bit more about this. We're only growing on the light conditions in the middle lot are really the only. It's one of the big limitations of growing on the ground in the city, obviously, and so the only lot that was viable for agriculture is the middle one. We were instrumental in organizing this space. We found out about it through, we got there was some facilitation from 596 acres. It was great. And we came together with a couple of community groups. One, a group of neighbors that wanted a community garden, and then this place called the Textile Arts Center, which is growing a natural dye CSA on one of the lots, and then a dinner church is also using half of one of the lots. And this coalition, without it, we wouldn't have been able to really transform these lots over the course of one summer. And there was a lot of community organizing work that wasn't agriculture related, but I think that we would not have made the progress that we made in terms of all of the city services, city agencies we tapped into, and all the work that got done would not have gotten done without that coalition of groups. So we organized this one. This our second site is right now we're building it out, and it's in Clinton Hill. And this is already a long established project. Paula, who I think has already talked, was instrumental in getting this off the ground. This is the Myrtle Village Green. It's a water tunnel access site that was recently turned over to the community, and we'll be building out around 2,000 square feet of production space there. In the top hand corner, you see this. That's a bunch of. We were anticipating having to make a really big soil purchase, but that was just donated from another mobile farm that had to move, or a slightly less mobile farm actually. What was that? Was half acre or 10-acre farms? Yeah.
So one of our major goals, and something that we knew from the beginning would need to be important, and this speaks to the presentation that just came right before, is mobility. And we focused on that in our design of these planters. So this land, our license to use it is, it's not definite that it will last for very long. It could end at any time, because it's a private landowner. He could decide that he wants to do a development project there, and we have to move these. So these beds are 3x3. They sit on your standard shipping pallet, and they're.
I'm just going to go right to this slide so we can see.
Yeah. These beds are standard shipping pallet size, and they're comprised of a number of pieces which we source from different suppliers. They're sub-irrigated, so they have a flexible drain pipe that's coiled like a nautilus shell at the bottom of them, and then they sit. That sits inside of a super sack. The Brooklyn Grange was kind enough to donate a number of super sacks to us. If you're not familiar with those, they're a shipping container that's kind of like a mesh plastic. It's food safe. Brooklyn Grange had their roof light material shipped in it. They also ship sugar and grain and other foodstuffs in these bags.
And they're 1 cubic yard, so they're really big when they're over there on the size of a full one.
And they're exactly the size of a pallet also, which is nice. And then that's lined with a food grade plastic, and then the soil goes on the inside. So we built 106 of these planters with this design.
On Bergen, but not quite. So we built 106 planters, about 2/3 of which are sub-irrigated, and then the other third are a mixture of using a mixture of soil mediums that we're evaluating in our research trial. So we're really comparing effectively raised beds, a couple raised beds with a couple different growth mediums to sub-irrigated planters, and we hope to do more. But we'll get more into the research trial in a second. Yeah.
Sorry.
So the reason that it goes without saying that we had to make this investment in 18 tons of potting mix because and we raised money on IOBY, and we had the Boring Hill Neighborhood Association gave us some money. We got a FEAST grant. I don't know if you're familiar with. I'm sure some of the audience is familiar with FEAST. But the lead or the soil test that we did on these lots led us to believe that it was completely unfeasible for agriculture, and actually we had to cap it because it's a little bit about 4 parts per million shy of the EPA designation of hazardous waste. So we're growing in containers, and we actually brought in wood chips and soil from city agencies just to put it down to keep the dust down. Because that's actually one of the biggest vectors for contamination. Is not people worry about bioaccumulation in plant tissue, but it's really dust and breathing in the dust, and specifically getting dust on leafy greens more than almost anything else. That's the biggest vector.
And just to add a little bit of comparison to this 1,000 parts per million lead, it's definitely high. If you can't grow food in it, it will cause brain damage. But a friend of mine, she had her soil in Carroll Gardens tested right in her backyard. She asked me for the information from Brooklyn College, which was mentioned earlier, about where she can get it tested. Her soil came back 3,000 parts per million in a backyard in Carroll Gardens, which is like $1 million ground stem or more. That's what the soil's like there.
Sure, and it's really so the methodology is you take a few 12 plugs, right? But because in this case, these buildings were just burned down and then bulldozed into the ground in like in the 1960s. It really there probably are parts in our lab that are, like 3,000 parts per million, I'm sure. So yeah, this is just some, there was a huge amount of organizing that we did, and that was really, this is a temporary space. Part of it's owned by HPD, one of the lots is privately owned. It took a lot of our time, but it's critical in that it's the only shot we have having a lot of community buy-in to potentially getting the space with less precarious tenancy, having a chance to grow in it for a longer period of time.
So, like Tom said, a large portion of the space that we had was for production and was just sub-irrigated. The other portion was dedicated to research, which we're going to talk about. But for the production piece, we grew about 100 food crops. We had 4 clients in total over the course of the season. So you know these places if you live in these neighborhoods around the Green or Park Slope area. Green Grape Provisions and Brooklyn Larder were buying these tomatoes, selling them on their countertops. And then 2 restaurants, Franny and Rucolas, they were also purchasing mostly sun-gold tomatoes from us, using them lots of different dishes. And we had an on-site market every Saturday morning, which had a beautiful umbrella with these rainbow colors. And we set up a little table with a variety of vegetables. And it was pretty fun to have a market.
Did you have to apply for any special permits to have a market stand on site?
We did not. Did we research that?
We did. Our site, probably they told you guys, is kind of complicated tenancy because it's like partially privately owned and partially, but the whole thing is also licensed as a greenfield space.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
So the other portion that wasn't being used for production, sort of market, we used for a research project, and Claire really spearheaded that, and her background, as she said, is in agricultural research.
And we did market everything also that came out of the research set. So it was, we tried to pick some very popular crops that lots of people are growing, and as everybody's been talking about, I'm sure I haven't gotten to very much over the last 2 days, but there's so many constraints in that urban agriculturalist space, and there's not the kind of like extension support that you might get or have access to in a rural context. And a lot of that is because there's not quite as much experience in trying to really do production in cities, and there hasn't been a lot of really rigorous scientific research on agriculture in cities, and I think that's really starting to change. And so we just we were interested in helping to kind of contribute to that new growing body of literature. And so what we did this year was just a really simple trial, like many people who are not growing on roofs. Our soil was totally contaminated. We had to bring in soil and do raised beds, and so we decided to do a test on 5 different raised bed designs and see how they performed on these very typical crop varieties. We did sun-gold tomatoes, lachinello kale, and cayenne peppers. And we did a random complete block design trial. We had 8 replicates of each bed, and so we have like a standard. This is, we don't have too much time, so I won't go into too much detail about the methods, but I'm happy to talk to people about that afterwards because we really put a lot of thought into it. But we did sort of a standard raised bed that like your typical community gardener might do. You bring in some topsoil, maybe the Green Thumb has a topsoil donation program. You amend it with compost. We did another with potting mix. We did a sub-irrigated planter. That was a potting mix. We did a sub-irrigated planter with a landscaping fabric barrier between the reservoir, and people have hypothesized that sometimes things, especially tomatoes, in sub-irrigated planters maybe aren't quite as flavorful because they get a little waterlogged because the roots can be sort of sitting in that reservoir. And then we did an African sack garden, which is sort of has a lot of the advantages of the sub-irrigated planter, but is a lot less expensive to build because you can use topsoil compost and you can use gravel, so you're not getting this like really technical soil mix. And also what we used to build our reservoir in our sub-irrigated planters was a perforated drain pipe, and I'll show you a picture of it. But again, so it's like a kind of an investment to get that. We were using like recycled plastics. And we looked at the beds based on the bed performance based on a variety of different parameters, the total yield, the marketable yield. We did a bunch of taste tests to have people evaluate the actual vegetables. We did labor inputs, water, which people, anecdotally you hear that these sub-irrigated planters often are much more water efficient and much more higher yield. Disease incidents, when we could start harvesting, and we put these together really fast, so the next slide is a couple of our results. And
So,
yeah, the y-axis is in pounds. So these are the different containers. So on the far left is the African sack. The C1 is that is actually the potting mix. This is the C2 is the standard raised beds with topsoil and compost, and then these are the two sub-irrigated planters. One is without the landscaping fabric, and one is with. And so these are the line in the middle of the box plot is the mean, and then you can see the distribution of the yields across the different sets. So yeah, I mean, and this is not, we have a lot of other controls because one of the issues, I don't know if you guys showed the video, but the light is a big constraint at our space. And so even with our research trial, which didn't take up a huge area, the light was different. And so we'll do a little more analysis to see how much of a factor that is in some of the differences that we're seeing. Yeah.
Of the last two, which one was with the landscape?
This one, too, is with.
Which one tasted better?
So I haven't had time to work that data up yet, but just
What do you think?
I did. So I participated in our tasting trial. So did Greg, and we went back, which you're sort of not really supposed to do. It was blind when we did it, but we went back and looked, and it's the landscaping fabric. It tended to make a difference. But actually, the African sack was kind of just from having, I did maybe 60 surveys of people, and just from like looking at them after I kind of explained the results to individuals as they did it, that was consistently the highest rated. The other things we tested in that was we looked at like color and size. Because the size of especially, we only did this also for the tomatoes. We didn't do it for the peppers or the kale.
yeah, anecdotally, there were some really strange results around the African sack gardens compared to the sips, especially later in the season. The tomatoes coming off the African sack gardens, these are sun-belt cherries. The diameters were much fatter.
Yeah,
we don't really
big,
know why.
fat
It was
cherry
really
tomatoes.
big tomatoes coming from this African sack design, and the sips were just much more normal. So.
Yeah, and one thing we really saw, and so these results that I'm showing are probably a little biased towards this because I don't have our newest data in this, but our sub-irrigated planters, even though we planted everything out at the same time, those started weeks earlier. They were ready for market I think when I looked 3 weeks earlier. I just glanced at it yesterday. And so our African sacks and our control that had the compost topsoil, they're still producing, we're still harvesting from them. And so that'll bump those numbers up a little bit. This is kale, and actually you really see, we'll show you the kale and the cayenne peppers, but you see a really similar pattern across all three. those two are quite a bit higher. They're pretty even with the control that has the potting mix, and then the other two are, at least the C2 is pretty much always statistically significantly lower yielding.
I love your map.
Does the black dot in the middle mean have significance?
It's an outlier, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, sorry. And
so one of
if
your
anyone,
C2s was way up there.
one of our C2s did very well, and so that is where I think when we look at light, it could be that one had much better light. There was this area that got pretty shaded out later in the season. It was our first season on this site, and we just didn't really know the pattern of light that well. And we didn't have a lot of choices either. We had one site at the beginning of the season, so we picked the sunniest spots, but we were still a little short. Yeah, and so, yeah, I actually would love to see that outlier. It's kind of always the same bed, because I don't even know that it's always the same bed, but it probably is. Yeah, and so cayenne peppers was a little bit of a tighter distribution, but similar pattern.
We saw the slide a little bit before, but like Claire was saying, we had these different bed designs. Some of them were sub-irrigated using this design that involved a flexible drain pipe. Some of them had a fabric in there over the drain pipe, and then the others used just more traditional methods, just a bag filled with soil, different mixtures of the soil, and then this African sack garden design. Some ideas around these planter designs that we've talked about internally, and I think people are probably interested in, and if you are, please just come see me or Claire or Thomas, that we'd like to make schematic diagrams of the actual bed designs. There are definitely improvements that we want to make over the winter, but there's an open hardware movement that's a sister of the open software movement, and we'd like to publish the designs in the open hardware movement as things that the other folks could go and build. And these are pretty standard parts. You can find super sacks everywhere now that
We got ours from the Grange, thank you.
yeah. And the other pieces are pretty easy to source as well.
On the design, real quick, where's the water input? Yeah, like the tube comes out of the bag at some point. I'm assuming.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're going to modify.
Water into
We
it.
want a smaller diameter tube
Okay.
that we can hook up to.
Are you getting rainwater? Is that what you're concerned about? Or?
We're concerned
No.
about rodents.
We're concerned about rodents, and we also, we can't really, the way we have it set up right now, we can't really automate it. And so we'd like to have something that we can kind of automate to make the watering process a little bit faster. That also, we use hydrant water right now, and so some of that is the way we have the tube coming out, and some of that is our hydrant.
Yeah. So we have
And
some.
the buses that go over.
We definitely have talked about, and similar to kind of the problems and challenges that you're facing. How do we automate the watering system? Because watering, it takes forever. It takes a lot of time, and it's just something that seems so obvious. We're going to talk about on the next slide some of our other automations. Watering can be automated in this, and people have been doing it for a long, long time. It's super obvious.
Yeah, and we watered very infrequently, but
Yes.
when we watered, it was like a whole day.
Yeah, it was 5 or 6 hours to water all the beds via hose from the hydrant, and that's a lot of time that could be spent doing many other things. As we all know, it's time-consuming work. So on the automation front, like I said, my background is in the software space, and Tom also works in the software space. So we we hacked together some hardware involving moisture sensors and light sensors and temperature sensors that monitor these variables. This is a moisture sensor covered with a small plastic cup. And, you can buy one of these for about $4, and this is a light sensor right here. It's like $3 or something. And what you can do, we have 2 different prototypes. One of them involves an Arduino, which some people might be familiar with. Another one involves a technology called XP, which is a wireless protocol It's developed by this company called Digit. The XB radios are cool because they can hook into multiple sensor inputs and then transmit data without using an Arduino, which is more economical. So, obviously there's some nice connections that can come about through this, right? If you're monitoring the moisture, you can auto-irrigate when appropriate, and you can save water because you can only irrigate in the places that you really need it. There's a lot of stuff happening with this idea right now. I mean, I don't know if you guys are watching this space, but there's just, I don't know, there's like design sites that are selling in-home plant monitors, and there's a lot of, there's some people like in the hydroponic growing space who are doing startups involving water monitoring, and there's a company called Bidponics. I don't know if you guys have heard of them. They're based here in New York. I met one of the gentlemen who is doing that 6 months ago.
Yeah, and there's lots of uses of this in kind of like larger scale industrial agriculture, and that's really expensive. And so we were, thinking of like ways we can make simple, appropriate designs for smaller scale growers that are a lot more accessible for that. For people that have less of a spend on this kind of thing. And especially we're also kind of a decentralized production. Our production is decentralized right now, and so we envisioned it as being both helpful kind of to feed into our research and also to kind of help manage these separate spaces.
Yeah, so monitoring multiple spaces simultaneously and then feeding the data into a centralized place and then saying, oh wow, I've got this dashboard and then I can see my sites and here's how the water is doing, or here how the light is doing in these different places.
And one of the little applications that we're going to do this winter is just have a temperature sensor in our raised beds and then in the ground just to see how, and in our hoop house, we'll see how much cooler our raised beds are.
Yeah.
Do you guys think there's any potential sort of like more smaller scale growers who incorporate their kind of data collection into what they do if they're doing monitoring to sort of have like back-end analytics on that stuff and kind of learn non-site specific insights?
Yeah, I think there is that possibility, and I think people are definitely looking at that problem. There's a couple of startups that I've heard about that are doing that type of thing.
It just helps more with like record keeping, not so much
Right.
research, just facilitate farmers to be able to at least like get a picture of their. Yeah, farmers are even gardeners.